There is one story humanity was never supposed to agree on. It appears in deserts and mountains, in frozen lands and tropical forests, in civilizations that never shared borders, never spoke the same language, never worshipped the same gods, and never read the same books. And yet somehow, they all preserved the same memory. Not a similar memory. The same one. They spoke of beings so large that ordinary men looked like children beside them. Creatures of terrifying strength, builders of impossible monuments, rulers, warriors, kings, and destroyers. Some traditions called them divine, others called them cursed. Some said they arrived before the flood, others said they vanished after a great catastrophe. But across continents and across millennia, one detail stayed almost untouched. They were giants. History tells us these are just myths, folklore, symbolic stories invented by ancient people trying to explain a world they did not understand. And for a long time, that explanation sounded reasonable, until the stones started raising questions. Because myths can be exaggerated, oral traditions can be distorted, old texts can be mistranslated, but carved rock, buried foundations, oversized tombs, and impossible architecture do not spread by imagination alone. They stay exactly where they were left. Silent, heavy, unmoving, waiting for someone to ask the forbidden question. What if the ancient world was not simply imagining giants? What if it was remembering them? And by the end of this video, you may not be asking whether giant legends existed. You may be asking why so many people worked so hard to make sure this subject was laughed at before it was investigated. So let's begin with the first mystery. Where did these stories come from? Normally, myths travel with people through trade routes, through invasion, through migration, through intermarriage between cultures. That is how legends spread. A civilization tells a story, its neighbors adopt it, and centuries later, the same tale appears in new forms across a region. That part makes sense, but the giant narrative does not behave like a normal myth. It emerges in places that had no meaningful contact with each other. It survives among peoples separated by oceans. It appears in civilizations divided not only by geography, but by time itself. And yet the pattern repeats so often that coincidence begins to feel like an excuse, not an answer. In the Hebrew Bible, they are remembered as the Nephilim, mysterious beings associated with great size, great power, and a world that existed before divine judgment fell upon the earth. The language is cryptic, but the impression is clear. These were not ordinary men. Later biblical passages describe lands inhabited by giant clans, whose presence terrified seasoned warriors. Move to ancient Greece, and the pattern grows stranger. There we find titans, cyclopes, and giants. Not one race of oversized beings, but several different origins, different roles, different wars. Why would one civilization invent multiple categories of colossal humanoid beings, unless the idea was already deeply embedded in cultural memory? Then travel north into Norse tradition. Before the gods ruled the cosmos, there was Ymir, the primordial giant. In that worldview, giants are not a side note in mythology. They are the architecture of existence itself. The world is shaped out of giant flesh, giant bone, giant blood. Even the gods are bound to them by lineage. And here is where it gets uncomfortable, because once you begin mapping these stories globally, they do not weaken, they multiply. The ancient peoples of Ireland told of the Fomorians, powerful beings tied to chaos, domination, and an older order of the world. In parts of Hindu and Jain cosmology, humanity itself is described as having once existed in vastly larger forms during earlier ages of time. In Mesoamerican traditions, earlier races of giant-like beings were said to walk the earth before destruction reset the world. This is not one culture dreaming wildly. This is a pattern. And patterns matter, especially when they survive in places that should never have shared them. Now, a skeptic could say that human beings everywhere invent large monsters because size represents power. That is true. It happens, but that answer only works until you notice how specific these traditions become. They do not simply describe large beings. They describe giant ancestors, giant builders, giant kings, giant enemies defeated in ancient wars. giant races that existed before the current order of mankind. That is no longer random mythology that begins to look like inherited memory. And if that sounds too dramatic, the next part of this investigation makes it even harder to dismiss, because legends are only the beginning. Soon, we run into caves, bones, burial mounds, and archaeological reports that were never meant to sit comfortably inside the word myth. And that is where the story stops being ancient folklore and starts becoming evidence. Because the deeper we dig into this story, the stranger it becomes. And if you want to keep uncovering the secrets history tried to bury, make sure you subscribe to this channel. And before you leave, tell me in the comments, do you believe giants were only myths? Or memories humanity was never meant to keep? Because your answer might shape where this investigation goes next. So far, we have only been dealing with memory, ancient memory, cultural memory, mythic memory, and skeptics are comfortable there. Because as long as giants remain trapped inside legends, they can be dismissed with one word: symbolism. But the story becomes far more dangerous the moment it leaves mythology and enters the ground. Because once bones, burial sites, and excavation records appear, the argument changes completely. Now the question is no longer, why did so many civilizations imagine giants? Now the question becomes, why did so many discoveries point in the same direction and then quietly disappear? This is where the investigation becomes deeply uncomfortable. In the early modern period, especially across North America, newspapers, local historians, and even trained researchers repeatedly described the discovery of unusually large human skeletons. Not one or two stories, not one isolated county. Reports surfaced from burial mounds, caves, ancient earthworks, and forgotten grave sites scattered across the continent. Of course, many of those reports were exaggerated. Some were hoaxes. Some were bad measurements. That much is true. But the problem is this: not all of them can be dismissed so easily, because mixed in with sensational headlines were formal excavation notes, institutional reports, and accounts from archaeologists whose reputations were built on careful documentation, not fantasy. And when serious observers begin describing skeletons far above normal human height, the subject can no longer be waved away with a smile. Take Lovelock Cave in Nevada. For generations, native traditions in that region spoke of a hostile group of red-haired giants. According to the oral accounts, these beings were violent, alien to the local tribes, and eventually trapped inside a cave where their story came to a violent end. To a modern listener, that sounds like legend, the kind of tale every culture builds around fear and survival. Except Lovelock Cave is real. And when excavations took place there in the early 20th century, they found human remains, artifacts, sandals of unusual size, and evidence that the site had been occupied in deep antiquity. Were those remains proof of a race of giants? Not conclusively, but they were enough to keep the legend alive, because the physical evidence did not kill the story. It fed it. And Lovelock is not the only place where folklore and excavation seem to overlap in disturbing ways. Across the Mississippi Valley in the eastern United States, ancient burial mounds have yielded reports of skeletons significantly taller than the expected average for their time. In some descriptions, the bodies were placed with ceremonial objects, copper ornaments, or arranged in ways that implied status, not deformity. That matters more than it seems. Because if an unusually tall skeleton appears alone, science can classify it as pathology. But when multiple large individuals are reported from elite burials, mound complexes, or clustered sites, something changes. Now, we may not be looking at a medical anomaly. We may be looking at a pattern. And patterns are what historians fear most when they contradict the accepted timeline. Then there are the accounts from outside America, in different regions of Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Archaeologists and local reports have occasionally described skeletal remains, whose scale did not fit comfortably into the expected human range of their era. Again, not every case withstands scrutiny. Again, some are surely misidentified, but that is not the point. The point is repetition. Different countries, different researchers, different decades. Same story. Unusually large human remains. Unusually large burial contexts. Unusually large questions. And yet, every time this subject approaches mainstream attention, the same thing happens. The case collapses, the bones are lost. The records are buried. The measurements are disputed. The photographs vanish. The institutions go silent. That pattern may be the strangest one of all, because in science, false evidence is usually exposed. But here, the evidence does something else. It evaporates, and whenever evidence disappears faster than it can be studied, suspicion does not die. It grows. So before we move on, stop and think about what that means. If giant discoveries were nothing more than foolish mistakes, why did they leave behind so much confusion? Why so many missing specimens? Why so many archive reports that are rarely discussed? Why do so many stories end not with explanation, but with absence? And that is exactly where our trail leads next. Because the next layer of this mystery is not built on rumor, tribal memory, or old newspaper drama. It is built on official institutions, on museum archives, on academic expeditions, on discoveries that were documented seriously enough to enter the historical record before they became inconvenient. And once we get there, the mystery stops looking accidental. It starts looking controlled. This is the point where most people expect the story to fall apart. Because legends are one thing, scattered discoveries are another. But once we step into the world of official institutions, academic archives, and museum authority, we are supposed to finally get certainty. We are supposed to leave behind rumor and enter the safety of documented truth. Instead, the mystery gets worse. Much worse. Because the deeper researchers looked into 19th and early 20th century excavation records, the more they found references to oversized skeletons appearing in places they had no business appearing at all. Burial mounds, ancient ceremonial sites, large-scale excavations led by trained investigators. These were not always drunken treasure hunters spinning frontier fantasies. In several cases, these were people writing formal reports for respected institutions, and one of the most disturbing names that repeatedly appears in this conversation is the Smithsonian. For decades, accounts circulated that unusual skeletal remains recovered across the United States were sent into institutional custody and then effectively vanished from public discussion. Now, to be fair, that does not automatically prove a conspiracy. Museums lose records. Collections are misclassified. Early archaeology was chaotic, and standards were nowhere near what they are today. But here is where the problem begins. If the giant skeleton reports were meaningless nonsense, then why were so many of them taken seriously enough to be collected in the first place? Why transport them? Why archive them? Why mention them in excavation summaries? Why allow them into the record at all, only for later generations to speak as if they never existed? That contradiction is impossible to ignore. In the late 19th century, mound excavations in North America produced reports describing skeletons far above the average height of surrounding populations. Some accounts speak of bodies laid out with grave goods that suggested status. Others describe central burials larger than those around them, almost as if the dead individual had occupied a position of power. Whether every one of these claims was accurate is not even the main issue anymore. The real issue is volume. When one strange report appears, it can be dismissed. When 5 appear, it becomes interesting. When dozens appear across decades, across states, across different excavators and publications, dismissal stops being an explanation. It becomes avoidance. And then something else happens. Something subtle, but incredibly important. The entire subject gets rebranded, no longer as a matter of unresolved archaeology, but as a joke, a fringe obsession, a tabloid fantasy for people who do not understand science. And once that label is attached, serious inquiry dies almost instantly, because most people would rather laugh than investigate. That may be the most effective form of burial ever invented. Not hiding the evidence underground, but hiding it beneath ridicule. And yes, fraud existed. There were fake giants. There were newspaper hoaxes. There were misidentified bones and sensational claims printed for profit. Anyone being honest has to admit that. But that truth has also been used like a weapon not to separate the fake from the real, but to discredit the entire subject in one stroke. That is the trick. Expose enough fraud, and no one looks at the legitimate anomalies. Create enough embarrassment around the topic, and no serious scholar wants their name anywhere near it. So ask yourself something very carefully. What if the greatest protection against a forbidden subject is not secrecy? What if it is humiliation? Because once a topic is culturally marked as ridiculous, it no longer needs to be censored. People censor themselves, and that may be exactly what happened here. But even now, all of this still leaves us with the problem. Missing bones are intriguing. Ancient reports are provocative. Institutional silence is suspicious. Yet none of it is enough on its own, because bones can be mismeasured. Records can be distorted. Witnesses can be wrong. So if this mystery is going to survive, it needs something stronger than memory. Stronger than rumor. Stronger than archives. It needs something physical. Something that cannot be laughed away. Something too massive to misfile. And this is where the investigation takes its most dangerous turn, because the strongest argument for giants may not be buried in graves at all. It may be standing in plain sight, in blocks of stone so enormous that even modern engineers hesitate before trying to explain them, in foundations so precise that they seem to belong to a lost level of capability, in ancient sites where the scale of construction feels less like human ambition and more like human imitation. And once you see those stones, the entire story changes, because bones can disappear, but architecture does not. Now we come to the evidence that does not fit neatly into mythology, or archaeology, or academic debate, because bones can be lost, records can be challenged, legends can be dismissed, but stone is different. Stone does not hallucinate. Stone does not exaggerate. And when entire civilizations leave behind blocks so massive, so precise, and so physically absurd that even modern engineers struggle to explain them, the giant question stops sounding childish. It starts sounding unavoidable. Take Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon. At first glance, most people see the Roman temple and assume the Romans built everything there. But that assumption collapses the moment you look beneath the visible structure, because the true mystery of Baalbek is not the temple itself. It is the platform under it. In its foundation lie the famous trilithon stones, gigantic monoliths weighing roughly 800 tons each. Think about that for a second. Not 8 tons. Not 80. 800. AHA 1 kut, transported, lifted, and fitted into place with astonishing accuracy. These are not crude boulders dumped into a wall. They are finished blocks, aligned with such precision that even today they seem to belong to a level of engineering that should not exist in the ancient world. And then it gets worse. Not far from the site, in the quarry, lies an even larger stone, the so-called stone of the pregnant woman. Around 1,000 tons. Nearby, archaeologists later identified another monolith even heavier, estimated at around 1,600 tons or more. That is beyond extraordinary. That is almost obscene. Because now we are not just talking about ancient people moving very heavy objects. We are talking about them preparing stones heavier than many modern lifting systems can comfortably handle. So, ask the obvious question. Why would any civilization even begin construction with blocks of that scale? Why choose the most difficult possible method? Why not cut smaller stones? Why create a logistical nightmare unless the builders were operating with either lost technology or a completely different relationship to mass, labor, and scale? And Baalbek is not alone. Traveled to Peru to Ollantaytambo, and once again the stones began telling a story that history cannot fully explain. Massive blocks, some weighing many dozens of tons, were brought from quarries across the valley, across rough terrain, across water, and uphill. Even today, transporting such material through that landscape would be a serious engineering project. But the real shock is not just the size. It is the finish. It is defeat. It is the unnerving precision. The lower megalithic stonework appears so exact, so tightly joined, that it looks less like ancient masonry and more like industrial fabrication. The surfaces seem worked to a standard that should not exist in a world without advanced cutting systems. Then, above that lower section, Later cultures often added smaller, rougher stones, with visibly different technique, and that contrast matters, because it looks as if two different civilizations touched the same site. One possessing extraordinary capability, the other inheriting what it could not reproduce. That same pattern appears again and again across the ancient world. The oldest layer is often the most mysterious. The biggest stones are often the earliest. The finest fit is often the deepest, as if history itself has been built on top of ruins left by someone greater. And then there is the issue no one likes to talk about: scale. At certain ancient sites, there are doors that seem absurdly tall, steps that seem strangely oversized, thresholds and architectural proportions that feel less comfortable for ordinary human use and more suited to beings of a different physical presence. Could that be ceremonial? Yes. Could it be symbolic? Of course. But when enormous architecture, giant traditions, missing skeletal evidence, and impossible stonework all begin converging in the same conversation, symbolism alone starts to feel weak. Because one mystery can be explained away, two can be debated. But when multiple lines of evidence all point toward a lost reality of larger beings, the burden shifts. Now the real question is not, why do people believe in giants? Now the real question is, why does the ancient world keep behaving as if it was built for them? And in the final part, everything comes together. The myths, the bones, the missing records, this stone. Because once all four are placed side by side, you are left with only two possibilities. Either humanity invented the most widespread and strangely consistent false memory in history, or the world we inherited is the shattered remainder of something far older, far greater, and far less human than we were ever taught to imagine. Now, step back and look at the full picture. Not one piece, not one legend, not one skeleton, not one temple. All of it. Because this is the moment where the mystery either falls apart or becomes impossible to ignore. Across the world, civilizations separated by oceans, languages, religions, and thousands of years all preserve the same core memory. That before us, or beside us, there existed beings of immense size and power. Not just monsters from bedtime stories, not random creatures invented to entertain children, but races, bloodlines, kings, warriors, builders, beings remembered as real enough to fear, fight, obey, or worship. Then we move from memory to discovery. Burial mounds, caves, excavation reports, oversized remains described again and again across different places and different decades. Some cases may have been fraud, some may have been error, but not all patterns survive by accident. And what makes this even more unsettling is not only what was reportedly found, but what can no longer be found. No. The vanished bones, the missing specimens, the archived references no one wants to reopen, the silence that follows every serious question. And then, above all of that, comes the stone. The final witness, the one thing no one can dismiss as folklore. Monoliths weighing hundreds, even over 1,000 tons. Foundations laid with impossible confidence. Structures whose lower levels appear more advanced than the civilizations that inherited them. Architecture so oversized, so precise, so physically unreasonable that it forces a question modern history still cannot answer honestly. Who built these things? And for whom? Because of ancient humanity, with primitive tools and limited machinery, truly raised all of this exactly as we are told. And why can we still not replicate some of it with ease today? Why do the oldest builders so often appear to have done the greatest work? Why do the deepest layers of history sometimes look less primitive and more advanced? That inversion should terrify us, because it suggests that history may not be a straight line of progress. It may be a ruin built over older ruins, a broken inheritance from a world that knew things we have forgotten. And maybe that is why giant traditions never died, because the memory of giants may not only be the memory of large baddies, it may be the memory of a larger civilization, a civilization of greater physical scale, greater architectural ambition, and perhaps greater knowledge of materials, force, and construction than anything officially credited to the ancient world. Now let's be honest. This does not prove that 20-foot giants walked every continent. It does not prove every legend literally happened. It does not prove every skeleton report was authentic. But that is no longer the real issue. The real issue is this. When myths, archaeology, institutional anomalies, and megalithic architecture all begin pointing toward the same possibility, disbelief is no longer the rational default. Investigation is, and maybe the biggest mistake modern people make is imagining giants only as fantasy creatures, as oversized humans from fairy tales. But imagine instead a population of people standing 7, 8, or even 9 feet tall, in an age when the average man was dramatically shorter than today. To those who encountered them, they would not seem merely tall. They would seem legendary. They would become the beings songs were written about, the enemies remembered in blood, the builders no one could imitate. The ruler's history later reduced into myth because myth felt safer than truth. And if even part of that is real, then the implications are enormous. Because then the ancient world was not just populated by forgotten empires. It may have been shaped by a forgotten type of human presence, one whose disappearance changed everything. Think about that. If giants existed, not as monsters, but as a real population, rare or powerful or technologically gifted, then their extinction was not just a biological event. It was a civilizational collapse. Their knowledge vanished. Their methods vanished. Their place in history was blurred until only fragments remained. A verse here, a legend there, a buried skeleton, a doorway too large, a block too heavy, a foundation too perfect. And now we live among those fragments. We build museums around them. We take vacations to them. We photograph them. We label them, but we do not truly explain them. Because maybe explanation would force us to admit something modern. Civilization hates admitting that the past may not have been smaller than us. It may have been greater. And maybe the real question was never, did giants exist? Maybe the real question is, what kind of world existed when they did? A world before the records were broken, before the memory was diluted, before the impossible was renamed mythology. So now I want you to sit with one final thought. If giants never existed, then humanity somehow invented the same impossible story over and over again across the entire planet and built monuments that still defy comfortable explanation. But if they did exist, then the greatest mystery is not why they disappeared. The greatest mystery is who decided they should be forgotten. And if the last traces of their world are still standing in stone around us, how much of human history are we still getting completely wrong? Because if even one fragment of the story is true, then history is not finished. It is waiting to be rediscovered. And here, on Channel Name, this investigation does not end with one video. It continues with every mystery we uncover together. So, if you feel that history still has secrets buried beneath the surface, subscribe to Our Explorers and stay with us as we search for answers others were afraid to ask. And before you leave, tell me in the comments, do you believe giants were only stories, or the last memory of a forgotten world? Because sometimes, the truth survives only when people are brave enough to question it.